Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Back with my friend Matt Gaspers. Hasn't been on the show in a while, but he's an expert in something going on in the world right now. You've all heard of the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. And this obviously raises the alarm for the encroachment of Zionism, for the, it was a takeover by ISIS, which is an Islamic militant group. The geopolitical implications. Assad is in Russia. He's got asylum there. There's all the threat of, World War III. I mean, everything is all concentrated into these converging conflicts in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. And it's causing a lot of consternation amongst those who are trying to understand what's going on. And as Catholics, we know that there's always a deeper understanding and even possibly a solution, which is accomplished through the faith and most specifically Our Lady. So we're going to talk about those things today, and Matt is going to guide us through that. Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Kennedy. Always good to be with you.
Excellent. Now, let's give the audience a breakdown, a rundown. We're going to go for about 49 minutes. I think I have a 49-minute cutoff. So we're going to go through a lot here in this little under an hour. But let's give a general breakdown of kind of what we're seeing and how this piqued your interest based on your thesis on what's happening with Islam, Russia, and so forth.
Yeah, so like you, I tend to see things, well, obviously we see things through the lens of the Catholic faith, but even more specifically through the lens of the message of Our Lady of Fatima, which is still the crucial, like the most vital message for the 21st century, because her promises, her instructions remain unfulfilled, and thus her great promise of the triumph of her Immaculate Heart remain unfulfilled. So I posted on social media the other day, Syria and Fatima, is there a connection? And yes, indeed there is, and that the connection is the nation of the people of Russia. Because Our Lady said in her Fatima message, July 13th, 1917, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia, and only Russia, to me, and she shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. Russia has still not been correctly consecrated by the Pope. What Francis did in 2022 is closer than what previous popes have done by mentioning Russia by name, but it was in the context of consecrating, what I forget the exact wording, but all of humanity, the church,
Russia
and
and Ukraine.
in particular Russia and Ukraine, and that's really not what Our Lady asked for. And what God wants is the exclusive, particular consecration of the nation of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, done by the Pope, and the Pope needs to order all the bishops to do it in union with him on the same day, probably at the same hour. And the reason for all of that is kind of twofold. I remember Father Gruner from the Fatima Center used to talk about the consecration will serve not only as sort of an exorcism, if you will, of that nation, but also as truly as a consecration, a setting aside of that nation to fulfill a particular mission in God's providential plan. And my thesis is that part of that mission is to really bring about the end of Islam. And I found this great quote in the series, multi-volume series by Dom Prosper
Yes.
Guéranger. Let's see, it's toward the end. It's time after Pentecost, so it's like volume 15. It's a great series. I highly recommend it. But this is on the feast of Saint Josaphat Kunchevich. Apologies if I didn't quite pronounce that last name correctly, but was an Eastern Rite. He was a Ruthenian bishop who was kind of like a bridge between East and West in his time, trying to bring back schismatic Orthodox into union with Rome. So it's very appropriate quote for this feast day. I think it's November 4th. Yeah, November 14th. So we read in that volume, Russia becoming Catholic would mean an end to Islamism, and I think that simply means Islam. It's another way of saying that. It's not like a lot of times modern people will distinguish between Islamism or jihadism versus the religion itself, and that's
Well,
a distinction.
in the past, they would say Mohammedanism was what they called Islamism.
Correct.
So it
Right.
means the spread of Islam, whatever you want to take that
Correct.
as. Yeah.
Correct. Yes. because Islamism and the violence and everything is inherent in the religion. Some people try to downplay that, but that's the fact of the matter. So Russia becoming Catholic would mean an end to Islamism and the definitive triumph of the cross upon the Bosphorus without any danger to Europe. This transformation will be the greatest event of the century that shall see its accomplishment. It will change the face of the world. Is there any foundation for such hopes? And providentially, there absolutely is, as we also see on the screen. And I just recited that promise of Our Lady of Fatima that in the end her Immaculate Heart will triumph, Russia will be converted. And contrary to what some people have tried to claim over the years, Our Lady didn't mean when she said converted that they would, stop being communist and become like a modern Western democracy. That's not what the word conversion means, folks. It means coming back into communion with Rome, becoming, in other words, becoming Catholic. It doesn't mean they need to embrace the Roman rite. I assume that they would maintain their liturgical, theological patrimony, but they do need to recognize the Bishop of Rome as the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, and come into communion with the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church from which they are currently separated in Russian Orthodoxy.
Yeah,
So,
let me just jump, because there's a couple things that people might need explained as well. For one, now I know that some people are going to say, because I think Bishop Schneider he does believe that the consecration of Russia was done. So people put that aside for a moment, because part of the promises, well, the first Saturdays have to be done as well, and any consecration is an act of faith. It's not a magic trick, no matter how it's done or who does it. So uh, people have a disagreement on that, and that's fine. That's not. People have different opinions, and that's okay. However, even if one believes it was done properly, there's still the necessity to fulfill the promises that are part of the devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And we still haven't seen the church instantiate officially. Some people don't know this. The First Friday devotions is like an officially promulgated, legal devotional promise, however you'd say that. The first Saturdays is a pious devotion that people do, and we believe in the words of Our Lady, but it doesn't actually have the same approbation or it doesn't have approval from the church. And that's another thing as well. We need to ask our bishops to do that. So whatever happened with Pope Francis's consecration, there's still much to be done when it comes to the message of Fatima, and that isn't accomplished. So we just can't sit by and say that everything's going to be as Our Lady said, because it just hasn't happened. The fulfillment of the message just isn't there. Now, the second thing as well is, you're right that the Russians would not have to become Novus Ordo or even traditional Latin Mass Catholics. I believe it was in a video from Father Gruner where he talked about, it was either he or one of the confidants was able to actually talk to Sister Lucy and be like, what does this mean? Convert Russia. And she was clear that it didn't mean becoming Roman Rite or Latin Rite. It just meant that you would be an Eastern church in communion with Rome. And there are many of those. And there is today, very small, but there is a group of Russian Orthodox, not Russian Orthodox, but Russian. I think it's called like the Russian Greek Catholic Church or whatever it's called. Very small group. I think their main bishop's in Australia, actually, randomly. But they are Russian. They have the same liturgy, everything, but they're in communion with Rome. So that's a conversion. And the last thing I'll say is, one of the craziest things I've heard, and I've heard this from big names and the who's who of Catholic commentary. Well, Russia did convert because they returned to Eastern Orthodoxy. They converted away from atheism. And I thought to myself, so I guess there's salvation. I mean, Our Lady's asking that there's going to be a resurgence of a schismatic church. This is absurd. I mean, we just can't accept this as Catholics. It makes no sense. So conversion means becoming united with Rome. It doesn't mean having a resurgence of Christian sentiment. As good as that may be, yes, Russia, for all its problems, and we all have problems, I'd much rather be raising, if I was wanting to be in Russia, I'd much rather be raising my children in a country with the morals that Russia proposes, because they definitely have, generally speaking, legally at least, a lot of the Christian morals. They're not all for the LGBT and stuff. So they have had a restoration of Christian sentiment, but it's all for naught if it's not united to the church.
Exactly. Yeah, and something else I want to clarify, because I've heard this before in response to my thesis sometimes that people they bring up, well, the West is just as evil as Russia is now, if not worse, and that's kind of missing the point. Like, yeah, I understand that that's true, but God asked for Russia, and that's His prerogative to do so. And I ended my talk in 2017. I gave a talk in 2017 called "The End of Islam: Russia's Future Role" at a Fatima Center conference, and I ended the talk with this quote from Father Malachi Martin, which he spoke a lot about Russia in his later years in a series of interviews, actually with a Canadian journalist, Bernard Jansen. You might know him,
Mhm.
Triumph Communications, I think. So he said in one of those interviews, in God's plan, salvation is not going to come from the West on the wings of our bombers. It is not going to come from our marvelous planes and fighting men. There is no salvation there. Salvation is going to come from the East. It is going to come because God has chosen Russia as the place to make the first great change, and this will teach the world. That's another thing that people need to understand. Like, a whole part of this, or a central part of the Fatima message, is this miraculous conversion of Russia, no less miraculous than the conversion of pagan Mexico, as a result of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who's behind me, and her feast is coming up soon, December 12th.
Yep.
It's going to be a sign for the entire, and an impetus for the entire world to convert. And that's something, including the West, that is in dire need of conversion. It's not like we're saying the West is wonderful and Russia is so evil and they need to convert. It's basically like St. Paul, that Russia is a vessel of election in God's plan, and it needs this consecration in order to be set aside and prepared for that mission. That's how
Yeah,
I
and I
see it.
mean this is biblical. I mean the Israelites constantly fell into moral degradation, but they were still the people chosen to guard the covenant and to be the nation of people from whence the Savior would come. So
Mm.
that a people isn't acting right doesn't mean they're not chosen by God. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, we'd have to deny all of salvation history. Before we continue, Matt, I need to do a shameless plug for our Canadian Martyrs Men's Conference. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you go to the link in the description there, the third annual Canadian Martyrs Men's Conference is taking place February 7th and 8th in Stratford, Ontario. Tickets are available at the link, and it is not the only traditional Catholic men's conference in North America anymore. There's another one now, but we are the first, so we're going to take that mantle. And Father Marcel Stannis giving the keynote, Al Smith speaking of Fulton Sheen experts, Fulton Sheen extraordinaire, no doubt going to be talking about some of the same themes you found in Fulton Sheen's work, and I'll be giving a talk as well. And TBD and another speaker. We're just working with some priestly schedules. Check out the link there. Last year we had about 220 men or something like that. We're going to be aiming for closer to 250 this year. Fill the room even more. It's a great time. So hope to see you there. So check the links there.
Nice.
All right. So where do we go from here?
Well, I guess to tie it back into the current news is going on with, what's going on in Syria, and I think it's the consensus seems to be, from what I've seen and hearing, is that that nation is it's pretty much already been handed over to Islamic true
It's
is
ISIS.
true
It's
Muslims.
ISIS.
Yeah, ISIS,
That's
Al Qaeda. Yeah.
that's been the crazy thing. I'm looking at all these politicians, Macron and Trudeau and whoever. Yeah, okay. I mean, we probably don't know the whole truth about Assad, like we don't know the whole truth about every supposed dictator. I'm not going to take it. I'm not making an opinion here on everything
Hmm.
he's ever done, but I just know I've always said this. Growing up in an Italian family, it's an open secret in Italy that they think the world is wrong about Mussolini, and they have reasons why the world is wrong about him. So I've always had this natural persuasion to be like, when the world tells you that your country is run by an evil dictator, it's very rarely the simple truth they're saying it is. Nonetheless, I'm sure he's done many evil things.
Hmm.
Point being, um, Macron, Trudeau, all these people talking about, the rebels have taken over and let democracy reign and all this. And I'm like, you idiots, it was ISIS, right? Like, that, like, I mean, really? The people that, slaughtered however many hundreds of thousands of Christians and displaced them around the world, the people that you were basically trying to bomb off the face of the earth when Obama was in office,
Hmm.
because they were filling the void that was made by Obama's. Anyway, but like this they're so tone deaf. They're at the point now where they're saying, "Yay, Assad is gone, and the rebels have taken over." It's like these rebels are the people that you were trying to kill like 12 months ago. So it's insane.
Right. Yeah, and the rebels are going to be the ones who are going to start slaughtering the Christians there. See,
Yeah.
what we really need in the Middle East, and including the Holy Land, what we need really is a new crusade. We need to reclaim those lands, a reconquista, just like, the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Many or some may not know. Um, the title Our Lady of Guadalupe actually predates the image on the tilma of Saint Juan Diego. It comes from Spain, Our Lady of Guadalupe in Extremadura, and is related to the Reconquista of Spain. In other words, the
Yeah.
kicking out of the Muslims in the 12 and 1300s and up
Mm-hmm.
into the 1400s. So it has that history and that connotation. If you want to deeper dive into that, I recommend watching a documentary that came out several years ago called "The Blood and the Rose." I'm pretty sure it's available on somewhere online to watch, or you can rent it or something. But gives a great explanation of all that history. But in order to launch a successful crusade and really rescue the Christians in the Middle East who are being slaughtered and persecuted by the millions, you have to have truly Christian, in other words, Catholic nations willing to do that, just like in medieval times. That's why there were crusades, because there were men filled with the true faith willing to go fight and potentially die for Christ in order to help fellow Christians. So it's going to take a nation that's truly been converted, truly is consecrated in the technical strict sense of the word, to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very reasonable to conclude that that nation someday will be Russia, to reclaim those lands, to stamp out the heresy of Muhammad, because it really is a heresy against Christ. It's a false religion also, but fundamentally it's a heresy full of
It's
Christological
it's
heresy.
it's like a Gnostic Arianism, basically. It's
Yeah,
with extra. It really. Hilaire Belloc called it a Christian heresy.
right,
Properly understood, it really kind of is.
right. So, what originally years ago got me interested in this whole topic, I mean, of course, after 9/11 happened, that's when I started getting interested in Islam. Like, what is this religion? And, I was fed the lies in the public school system and elsewhere that, oh, it's really a religion of peace. Remember, that's George W. Bush, I think, actually said that in a public speech shortly after 9/11, that this isn't the fault of Muslims or Islam. It's just these radicals who misinterpret things. We hear the same nonsense from Pope Francis in official statements, documents, etc. So I started researching the religion itself and found it to be, totally abhorrent. Not only is it heretical and blasphemous, but it is inherently violent. That's very obvious, and contrary to popular opinion, they don't have some kind of special relationship with what's called the people of the book in the Quran, to not do any harm to them. People of the book meaning Jews and Christians. I have here, I'll read you a quote. Um, I catalog some of these in this booklet, Fatima, Islam, and Our Lady's Coming Triumph, based on a conference talk I gave, and transcript is available online if you search for it. So let's see here's what the Quran has to say about jihad. Let me see here. Um, Not equal are those believers who sit at home and receive no hurt, and those who strive and fight in the cause of Allah with their goods and their persons. Allah has granted a grade higher to those who strive and fight with their goods and persons above those who sit at home. And it also says, uh, where is this quote I'm looking for? It says, even if they are the people of the book, you should fight them. I know that there's a quote to that effect. I'm not finding it at the moment, but anyway, they're even supposed to fight against Jews and Christians, and I think we all know they have a special hatred of the Jews, which is they make pretty explicit, a lot of them.
Well, and
So,
The Quran, you find things that contradict each other all the time. You know,
right.
the best guy online right now about Islam is Sam Shamoun. I don't know if you've ever seen some of his videos, um,
Okay.
but he's the best, and he has all these guys on his show to debate all the time, and he knows the Quran better than they do. And he'll cite the various surahs against each other and say, well, this says this here, this is that there. And the answer is always something very Gnostic. It's like, well, you don't understand unless you're a true believer. You can understand the mind of Muhammad and all this kind of stuff. And it's like,
Right.
okay, that's how modernists talk. But anyway,
Yes, exactly.
yeah.
So what got me interested in the topic of Islam originally was 9/11 and being told that it was a religion of peace and finding out that was certainly not the case. But then I read sometime after that True Devotion to Mary, and St. Louis de Montfort says some very interesting things in that work about the age of Mary, which I think we can associate with the age of after the triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. It seems to fit together quite nicely. So he wrote in that book, the power of Mary over all devils will be particularly outstanding in the last period of time. She will extend the kingdom of Christ over the idolaters and Muslims, and there will come a glorious era in which Mary will be the ruler and queen of human hearts. And he also says, Mary must shine forth more than ever in mercy, in might, and in grace in these latter times. In might, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, against the enemies of God, idolaters, schismatics, which would include the Russian Orthodox, Mohammedans, Jews, and souls hardened in impiety, who shall raise in terrible revolt against God to seduce all those who shall oppose them and to make them fall by promises and threats. And finally, she must shine forth in grace in order to animate and sustain the valiant soldiers and faithful servants of Jesus Christ who shall battle for his interests. There's another great quote that I found from Archbishop Fulton Sheen in his book, The World's First Love, regarding the eventual conversion of Muslims and the essentially eradication of Islam through through the intercession of Our Lady. He wrote in that book, it is our firm belief that the fears some entertain concerning the Muslims are not to be realized, but that Islam instead will eventually be converted to Christianity, and in a way that even some of our missionaries never suspected. It is our belief that this will happen not through the direct teaching of Christianity, but through a summoning of Muslims to a veneration of the Mother of God. And he said, missionaries in the future will more and more see that their apostolate among the Muslims will be successful in the measure that they preach Our Lady of Fatima, because the name Fatima also has an Islam connection.
Yep.
That was Muhammad's daughter. So very interesting connections with all, how we see as part of this coming age of Mary, which is very much part of the message of Fatima, the triumph of her Immaculate Heart, the miraculous conversion of Russia, period of peace, includes Mary triumphing over the crescent that she's, the crescent moon she's standing on, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And even says in the Psalms, which I quote, I think at the end of one of these talks, what did I say here? Yeah, so the triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart, through her triumph, Christ the King, may Christ the King reign supreme till the moon be taken away, which is from Psalm 71, a messianic prophecy. And obviously the crescent moon is associated with Islam, so I thought that was an interesting take on it. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, with everything that's happening right now geopolitically, but also with the new Trump administration, obviously it's not he hasn't been, what's the word, in office, sworn into office. How do you say it?
He hasn't actually been his second second administration hasn't been inaugurated yet.
Inaugurated.
That
Yeah.
happens on January 20th.
Right. So that hasn't happened yet, but obviously we see a bunch of these different guys who'll be in his cabinet or whatever. And the fella who's going to be in charge of military things, Peter Hesketh, or what's his name?
Oh yeah, I can't. It's something like that, Hesketh.
Well, I mean, he's like, yeah, he's got the Crusader crosses and stuff tattooed all over him, and he's all about like we need, strong Christian presence in the Middle East, and
Mm-hmm.
he said things like crusade and things, and everyone's like, yeah, that's awesome. But the guy's like a dispensationalist. I mean, when you look at his,
Mm-hmm.
he's super pro Israel for like kind of those weird evangelical Protestant reasons. And it
Mm-hmm.
just comes to show that the solution can't just that's only going to make things worse. I mean, there might be,
Right.
I mean, it might make trips to the Holy Land more enjoyable if you're on a pilgrimage or something, because there'll be like
Mm-hmm.
a cleaning up of some of the skirmishes or something. I don't know, maybe. But in the long run, this just exacerbates the problem of this Zionist push, which is in many ways the root of Islamic resurgency and terrorism. I mean, yes, we know that Islam has in it inherent violence, but Islam is like Protestantism. There's no central authority. There are various different schools. You know, the Shiites are very different than the Sunnis, and it is interesting that that Assad being a Shiite, that country is now fallen, because the thing about, as far as I can tell, the thing about the Sunni is that it's a lot like Protestantism, where there's basically different preachers, there's different schools
Mm-hmm.
of thought, and you see this when you watch different Muslims in debate with other Christians and stuff. Is that you have to really understand what that individual believes about how he interprets Islam based on the school,
Mm-hmm.
the imam or whoever that they follow, and these do kind of change country to country. And so historically, you've seen the adoption of Islam by like the Ottoman Empire, for example. And the Ottoman Empire is basically Greeks, as much as they might want to hear that. But ethnically speaking, they're basically Greeks, and they had adopted a type of Islam that they were definitely imperialist as far as their country was concerned, for sure. Like they obviously with Lepanto and all these kinds of things. But the whole like skirmishy terrorism thing, that never really was a big thing. It never really kind of took place
Mm-hmm.
because they were an imperial power. They were not like a rebel guerrilla kind of thing. But when Zionism really starts to take root in the 1920s and 30s in the Levant, this is kind of where we see the modern understanding of this terroristically based jihad. Before it was imperialism, as I said. It was jihad. This isn't to take away from it, but it was very black and white. It was like, we are the Muslim empire of this. We are the Ottomans. We are the whatever. We're coming to bring the crescent moon to your place. But it was done in a sense of a colonial imperial enterprise, and it was military versus military. Bloody,
Right.
wrong, awful, not justifying, but that's what it was. When Zionism comes into what is historically Christian, and of course, Palestine being under the control of the Ottoman Empire for so many hundreds of years, was essentially a Ottoman satellite state.
Mm-hmm.
The stream of Islam that was there was very much a laissez-faire kind of. They had lived together for so long. They lived in relative peace. This happens, right? I mean, there's different, streams of it, different places. What happens?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Zionism comes in, and the remigration of many different Jews from all over the world. They start to do things that are pretty egregious, and because it's kind of a failed state at that point, there's obviously the conflicts between the interests of the Syrians, the interests of the French in the region, the interests of the British, and so on and so forth. And you start to have these internal conflicts, and that's another story for another day. So what happens? Well, the only way that these basically these preachers start to basically say, listen, everything's been taken away from you. And it's true. They did a terrible thing to the Muslims there. Objectively speaking, is what they did to citizens. It was very bad. And now all you have left is terrorism. Now all you have no military to speak of, in the sense of, we're going to fight you. You can't fight against the British Empire. You can't do that. So what are we going to do? Well, we're basically going to do this sort of guerrilla warfare thing where we just have these skirmishes and blow stuff up and whatever. And then you have this doctrine of the, they really get this amplified presentation of this doctrine of being a martyr with the sort of suicide missions. And that becomes part of it. Now that is sadly like in the DNA of what happens in the Palestinian areas of the Levant. And it's sad to see, but they talk to kids and things like that, and they're totally okay with it, and they can't wait to go be a martyr and do whatever. And again, none of this is to justify Islam in any stretch of the imagination, but it is to say that the historical consequences of Zionism, which are going to be continually pushed by this Christian dispensationalism, are only going to make the problem worse, and the only solution is the true conversion.
Absolutely right. As I'm pretty sure I've posted on X or Twitter in the past, I mean, Islam is an evil and dangerous ideology, and so is Zionism. They both
Yes.
are. Both are part of the problem. They're kind of two sides of the same coin in one sense, because they're both very racist and they're both full of errors and blasphemies and heresies, et cetera, et cetera. So the only answer is to bring in, as you said, the true faith. That's what's going to be the ultimate answer to peace in the Middle East, that they need to convert and become brethren in Christ in the true church, or there's never going to be peace. As Pius XI says in Quas Primas, men must look for the kingdom, the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
And it's very interesting to consider all the providential, like, it's interesting to see the role of Muslims in the Holy Land, because having that temple on the mount there is probably one of the only reasons that they haven't built the new temple, the third temple, which will
Mhm.
be the end of the world, according to Catholic ecclesiology. It's just so intertwined, and there's no natural solution. There is no geopolitical. It doesn't matter if you make the capital Jerusalem or what, any of these things, and we're not
Mhm.
going to fix it with some, otherwise virtuous and noble patriot who's into this crazy fundamentalist dispensationalist stuff. It's just not going to be good. But anyway, but what else? We were talking about some of this stuff before. What else did you have?
Well, I wanted to share a little bit. I think it's also going to be very appropriate for Russia to be involved, as I think it will be in the end of Islam, as I say. And the quote from the beginning from Guéranger says, because they have a history, certainly in Soviet times, and probably even into the uh, long presidency of Vladimir Putin, in aiding and abetting, or you might even say co-opting these very militant groups within Islam who are have a lot of motivation to go after Jews in particular to get their land back in some cases. So I came across there are a couple of Soviet defectors who have made comments to this effect about Soviet Russia seeing the great potential that Islam has to serve the purpose of the revolution. One of them was Anatoly Golitsyn,
Mm-hmm.
who died in 2008, and he's been referenced by Catholic commentators. I know Fatima Center has some stuff on him and published in Catholic Family News as well. But he was a former KGB officer. He defected in 1961, and he basically became an informant to the CIA, to U.S. intelligence. The same thing with Lieutenant General Ian Mahai Pachepa, who died just a couple of years ago. He was the former head of intelligence, foreign intelligence for communist Romania, and he defected in 1978. So Golitsyn authored two really groundbreaking books on this subject, revealing lots of secrets. The most famous of which is New Lies for Old from 1980, published in 1984, and then also the Perestroika Deception. He was convinced that this whole notion of perestroika, or restructuring the Soviet Union, becoming more like the West, was really all just a deception, was just smoke and mirrors, that ultimately Russia remained at its core very communist, very collectivist, very authoritarian, which, a case could certainly be made for that. But Golitsyn noted in New Lies for Old, he talks about this conference of Muslims of Asia and Africa. Was held in March of 1965 in Indonesia, and 35 countries were represented. The Mufti of Central Asia and Kazakhstan, Bakavhanov, led the Soviet delegation. The conference discussed, and just to be clear, the Soviet Union included lots of different so-called republics, many of which were very Islamic because of their
Chechnya.
inhabitants. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
All the stands.
So, right. So Golitsyn wrote in 1984, the conference discussed the use of Muslim proselytizing societies as weapons against imperialism, meaning the West. The need to harness Islam to the service of the revolution has been openly discussed by communist strategists. And this is Golitsyn still, based on Soviet experience in Central Asia, as you mentioned, the stands, the former Soviet republics ending in stan, The problem of achieving this goal is considered difficult but soluble or achievable. And then in his 2013 book, Disinformation, Pachepa wrote the following. He said, and this is all about a man named Yuri Andropov, who was the head of the KGB, Soviet Secret Service or secret agents, whatever, secret police, I guess would be the better term. He was in charge of that from 1967 to 1982. And Pachepa recounts how it was Andropov who concocted the strategy of harnessing Islam by tapping into its perennial hatred of Jews in particular and the West in general. Here's what Pachepa wrote. By 1972, Andropov's disinformation machinery was working around the clock to persuade the Islamic world that Israel and the United States intended to transform the rest of the world into a Zionist fiefdom, which, there could be some truth to that in some circles. But anyway, according to Andropov, or I guess according to certain people, I guess I should say, Pachepa says, according to Andropov, the Islamic world was a petri dish in which the KGB community could nurture a virulent strain of America hatred grown from the bacterium of Marxist Leninist thought. Islamic anti Semitism ran deep, as Pachepa acknowledged. So in 72, they started this Operation CIG, and this was the code name for a socialist division of labor aimed at turning the Islamic world into an explosive enemy of the United States. The Romanian DIE, equivalent of their KGB, their sphere of influence for the operation embraced Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria. The DIE's task was to scour Romania for trusted Communist Party activists belonging to Islamic ethnic groups, train them in disinformation and terrorist operations, and infiltrate them into its target countries. According to a rough estimate received from Moscow, by 1978, the Soviet bloc intelligence community had sent some 4,000 such agents of influence into the Islamic world. End quote. Now, I'm sure that the United States government could have very well been doing the same thing, not necessarily in the 70s, but I think I've read, people claiming that our government, the United States government, had a hand in forming Al Qaeda,
Hmm.
might have even had some connections with bin Laden and things like that. So I'm not saying the U.S. is completely innocent in this regard, but here is an actual defector with inside information saying these things, which I find very interesting.
Well, also, we could just break down how simpatico Islam can be with communism. Um,
Mhm.
well, what did Fulton Sheen say? He said the West wants Christ without the cross, and the East wants the cross without Christ.
Mhm.
Um, the error of that both sides of the equation have a fundamental error in where they make their distinctions. So in the West, we want classic liberalism, which is just a
Do
rejection
what
of the.
thou wilt.
It
Do
is. It
what thou
really
wilt
is.
shall be the whole of the law.
It's Satanism in that sense. But it's a rejection of the authority of the church. Okay. In the West or in the East, whether it's in communism or whether it's in Islam, there is, and obviously communists would say they're atheists, but nonetheless, the state is their church.
Mhm.
The Marxism is their gospel. And
Right.
there's no distinction between the church and the state. There's no distinction between Islam and the state. The state is the caliphate is the religion is the caliphate.
Mhm.
In some ways, that's closer to the truth of what we might call an integral Christendom, because the church does have real authority. But there's always been this understanding that there's a distinction for peoples and for what are natural law principles, for things like toleration, and also for the distinction between the direct and indirect power of the church. These things are
Right.
fleshed out, and it's very important to do so because this is basically the two swords of Christendom that must be their own sword, because the church must be independent in order to, like St. Ambrose, to call the emperor to repentance.
Mhm.
If he's an employee of the emperor, that's very difficult to do.
Right.
Um, but he also needs the emperor because sometimes the emperor will do things like tell the bishops of the world in the different places to get their act together and get to a council. And this is the symbiotic, inherited nature of this union, yet separate, not separation in the arbitrary classic liberal sense, but distinction, but relationship um,
Yes.
in the Christian conception. This is gone in communism, and this is gone in Islam. So you
Yep.
can adopt. I mean, let's look at some of the doctrines that are common in Islam. So for many have heard of the doctrine of taqiyya, basically. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right.
Yep.
And you can basically use deception. You can basically say things that aren't true if it helps the greater cause. You can basically lie about what you believe or what your goals are so that people get on your side. Marxists can do this. Islamists can do this.
In
We
other
can't
words,
do
the
this.
seventh commandment, the seventh, what is, no, the eighth commandment, right? Shall not bear false witness.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not absolute in either of those systems.
No, it's not. It's relative to the circumstance.
Yep.
Jews can do this too, by the way. They do this all, Ben Shapiro, Ben Shapiro does this. The school that
Yep.
he comes from, like if you actually look into he'll make mention of some of his rabbinical teachers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
These guys are like the worst of the worst. And he'll just say, oh, I love, tolerance. It's like, no, the guy you're following is actually basically trying to ultimately thinks Christians are anyway.
Yeah.
But all of them can do this. And this is why they can all become totalitarian. And the church has always been against totalitarianism. There's not a strict church position on how a government ought to run, as much as some integralists might want to write a 400-page book arguing against my thesis that I just said that I'm not right. Nonetheless, what we do know is sure about, let's call them Catholic social principles, is that the church has authority that is direct and indirect. The state has its proper realm of authority, and they must be free to govern within their own realms for the cohesion that is necessary. And there are prudential decisions about toleration of false religions and so forth, yet they never have their rights in the positive sense. And this is gone. So in Marxism and in Islam. So this is when you have if you look at a totalitarian state, like one of these very strict fundamentalists, whatever the word would be, Islamist state, and you look at a Soviet state, change the Marxism for the Islamism, and you have basically the same governing principles.
Mm-hmm. There's a great Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who was a professor of strategy and irregular warfare at something called the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. He has a podcast. He worked in the Trump administration, the first administration, and President Trump has asked him to come back in the second one. He wrote a great book on this called Defeating Jihad, the Winnable War in 2016. And here's what he has to say about the similarities between communism and Islam. The similarities between communism and groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State are too numerous and fundamental to be ignored. Both groups are driven by a totalitarian vision. The followers of Karl Marx envisioned a world transformed into a workers' paradise in which other classes have been destroyed and only one party, the Communist Party, was in control. Today's jihadists also have a universal vision. They look forward to a global caliphate in which all have submitted to the will of Allah and live as Muslims, the infidels and apostates, meaning those who have left Islam, having been slain. Both visions are exclusive, absolutist, and totalitarian. They are predicated on a them or us vision of how the world must be. There is no possibility of peaceful coexistence with the other. And in Islamic ideology, they have what's called the Dar al-Harb, which is the abode of war, where they're spreading Islam, and the Dar al-Islam are, see if I'm getting this quote right. Check it out here. But there are two spheres in the world exclusively, and the one always needs to be expanding. It's never until the entire world is the Dar al-Islam, which is the abode of Islam, the house of Islam. Their work is not done. But the difference between them and Christianity, Catholics, is that they spread their faith at the edge of a sword, where ours is the work of evangelization and winning hearts and minds for Christ with the help of the Holy Ghost and the action of grace. So
yeah, and let's just summarize here. We got to end in a few minutes. This summarize, people. Listen, There are three main players for world domination. And I've said this in a show before. The Eastern Gnostic religions, the Eastern pantheistic ones, as wrong as their doctrines are, they really don't care about making converts. That's pretty clear. They're very difficult to convert because their understanding of the supernatural is, as the late Dr. Wolfgang Smith said, it was antipodal. It was the complete opposite with a completely different focus. So it makes it difficult to evangelize, which is why the church has had such a hard time in places like India. Nonetheless, they're not looking to really convert anybody. They'd have problems, but they're not looking to convert. Jews do not want to make converts in the explicit sense, but they do want to make converts in this subversive sense. You can find this in the Talmudic writings. You can find this in the actions of many Jewish commentators today. They're totally cool with you being a Christian as long as your Christianity fits in their Judaism. They want to convert
and
you.
ultimately serves them, right, as a second-class
Exactly.
citizen.
So
Right?
they're looking, and I mean this. All of the religions are looking to dominate the world. That's the only thing that makes sense. Obviously, if you think that you have the truth and this is from God, you're going to have some motivation for people to get on board because it's kind of a big deal. This isn't a conspiracy. We don't have to look at, secret meetings or whatever. That's a nice rabbit hole to go down to, and there's some fruit in some of that. There's some kookiness in some of it, but there is some benefit in some of it. But take that out of it. If you believe that you have revelation from God and there is a plan for your people, then you're going to want to put that plan into action if you think it's true. What else are you going to do? Everyone, you start a business. You want everyone to come to your business. You write a book. You kind of want people to read your book. You put up a YouTube video. You'd like people to see your video. If you didn't want to, you wouldn't do that. So this isn't a conspiracy or an anti this or an anti that. It's just the logic of the thing. Christians, we want to conquer the world through grace. Muslims want to conquer the world through force. Jews want to conquer the world through subversion. The only solution to these three, the only one of these that is tenable is obviously the true one, that is the Catholic faith. Islam is very in your face, and it's going to be a war of words or a war of force in other ways. Judaism is going to be very sneaky and try to subvert you to their purposes. But the only solution to all of these things is the Catholic faith, and it is the Virgin Mary. And we're just coming up on Our Lady's feast day. It's not a traditional feast day, but it's traditionally in Mexico a feast day, but it's, I don't know if it's a universal day, but point is the traditional feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe is very, very near and dear to my heart. And we should all be praying to convert the Jews and the Muslims. Muslims would be the best Catholics. Like these, just think about it. Old school values. I know there's problems, but grace perfects nature, right? Old school values, tough. I mean, they're doing this fasting stuff with no help of sanctifying grace. They stick to their guns. They don't sway because of a lot of social pressure the way that Christians and often do. They would be the best Catholics. We should be praying for the conversion of Muslims, primarily to save their soul, but secondly, because it would honestly be so awesome to have them in the fold for so many reasons that would help so much with peace in the world. And lastly, the way to do this is to pray for the conversion of Russia. People disagree on whether or not the consecration was done. Fine. Russia hasn't converted yet. A consecration is an act of faith that includes fulfilling the messages of Our Lady of Fatima, which means doing your first Saturdays, and it means praying the rosary every day for world peace. And if you're not doing that, as Taylor Marshall says, you're not on the team. Anything to say before we conclude here?
Maybe I'll just drive home the point about Russia's conversion
Sure.
by this quote from Father Joaquin Alonso, who was the official Fatima archivist for I think over a decade, or actually over 16 years. And he had numerous interviews with Sister Lucia during his tenure. He published a book afterwards called The Truth About the Secret of Fatima, and this is what he wrote therein. Lucia has always thought that the conversion of Russia does not extend only to a return of the Russian people to the Christian Orthodox religion while rejecting the Marxist atheism of the Soviets, but that it refers simply and fully to the total and integral conversion by a return to the unique and true Roman Catholic Church. That is from a man who knew Sister Lucia very well for years. So
there you go. So pray for the conversion of Russia. Pray for all the Christians in the Middle East right now that are going to be displaced, and hopefully that's all that happens to them. And yeah. So, all right, Mr. Gaspers. I have to mention one more thing before I go.
Mm.
For those who know that I have a Substack, I am launching a new series. So you can check out my Substack. It's meretradition.substack.com. And the charismatic book will be released, God willing, in like 2 or 3 days in print. But all of the chapters are going to be available by that time. Almost all of them are digitally. And if you want to listen to the audiobook, every chapter has its audio reading of it, and then it will also be available on audio on Audible. But if you don't want to sign up for an Audible description, you can sign goodness, I can't speak subscription. You can sign up for a subscription to the Substack, which is cheaper than Audible, and you can get the audiobook as well as the digital copy of it, as well as everything else. And I'm going to be launching a 6 to 10 part series on modernism. So stay tuned for that. So meretradition.substack.com. And that's my last shameless plug for myself. All right, Matt. Thanks for coming on.
Awesome.
And,
Thanks for having me.
And I think that's all we have for you today. So pray for all those things we said and have a blessed rest of your Advent. And if you don't see me or I don't see you, dear viewer or listener, before Christmas comes, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. And there you go. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this has been another edition of Mere Tradition. Until next time, God bless you all, and I'll see you soon.